All right, so today we're gonna deep dive into a story that sounds like something straight out of like a political thriller. Like you couldn't make this stuff up.
Right. Yeah.
Ukraine in the middle of a war with Russia, negotiating mineral rights with U.S. And get this, the U.S. is like, hey, how about you pay us back for all this aid, dollar for dollar.
Wow.
But we're not talking cash. We're talking rare earth minerals, this stuff that like powers our phones and our laptops and like all that tech we can't live without.
It's pretty wild.
It is, and our source for this deep dive is this. It's an article from VOA News, and it lays out this whole potential deal. Yeah, all the power dynamics and some pretty surprising players.
Who?
Like former President Trump.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So before we like get into all of that, let's set the stage a little. Russia has been waging war on Ukraine for 3 years now, and the U.S. has been like a major supporter, sending billions and billions of dollars in aid. And so now with the war, dragging on, the question of repayment is like starting to come up,
Right.
but in a pretty unconventional way.
Yeah.
So this idea that like Ukraine essentially pays back the U.S. with mineral rights is kind of like, whoa, hold on a second.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Is that even a fair deal? And like, why is the U.S. so interested in these, as they're called in the article, rare earth minerals?
Yeah. So I think the big question is, why are these minerals such a big deal? And, rare earth minerals are used in pretty much all our technology. It's not just smartphones. It's all sorts of high-tech equipment, even military equipment.
Oh, wow.
So the U.S. and pretty much every other developed country is realizing that they need to secure a reliable source of these minerals for their own, economic and national security.
So it's almost like instead of like a check, the U.S. is asking for something that could like, give it a technological edge in the future?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is about strategic resources.
Right.
And it also reflects a larger global trend. China currently dominates the rare earth mineral market, and this potential deal with Ukraine could be a way for the U.S. to diversify its sources and, become less dependent on China. It's all about resource control.
Yeah, and like, it's not as simple as just saying, hey, give us your minerals, right? The article mentions that Zelensky, he initially resisted these U.S. demands, so there's definitely some tension in these negotiations.
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple situation.
What kind of leverage does each side have in this scenario?
Well, the U.S. is Ukraine's biggest backer in this conflict, right? They're providing vital military and financial aid, and that gives them leverage. But at the same time, Ukraine desperately needs that support to continue defending itself against Russia. They're in a very vulnerable position. It's a tough spot to be in.
Yeah, for sure. And this is where it gets even more interesting. The article talks about Zelensky like appealing directly to Trump for understanding and security guarantees. He's even quoted as saying, I want very much from Trump understanding of each other. Security guarantees from Trump are much needed. I mean, why is Trump, someone who's no longer in office, a factor in these negotiations?
Well, Trump has always had an unconventional approach to foreign policy, right? He prioritizes personal relationships and deal-making over traditional diplomacy. And his relationship with Putin, that's always been a bit of a mystery. So it makes you wonder what role he's playing behind the scenes.
Yeah, but Trump's out of office now, so does he really have any sway over these negotiations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? His influence might be less direct now, but his voice still carries weight, especially with his ongoing relationship with Putin. And don't forget, he's been very critical of past U.S. aid to Ukraine.
Right, and speaking of that, the article talks about how Trump believes past U.S. aid to Ukraine wasn't really all that beneficial for the U.S., and he seems to be like really pushing for this repayment idea. How does that line up with, the agreements already in place between Zelensky and the Biden administration and the U.S. Congress?
You bring up a good point. Trump's stance adds another layer of complexity, right? It could clash with existing agreements. It's almost like two different approaches to foreign policy are at play here. On one hand, you have the Biden administration and Congress, who have largely supported aid to Ukraine without explicitly demanding repayment. And then you have Trump pushing for this more transactional approach, even though he's not in office. It's a strange situation.
It definitely is. And it sounds like Trump's personality and his history as like a real estate deal maker are still part of this equation, even years after leaving the White House.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, is this about furthering U.S. interests, or is it about personal ambition? It's hard to say for sure, but Trump's involvement certainly adds a layer of unpredictability to an already complicated situation.
And then there's this really powerful anecdote in the article. Zelensky said that he would be willing to step down if it meant achieving peace for Ukraine. I mean, what does that tell us about, like, the pressure he's under and the tough choices he's facing?
That statement is it's incredibly powerful. It shows the immense weight on his shoulders as a leader of a nation at war. He's clearly struggling with the responsibility, torn between the need to defend his country and the desire for peace. It really humanizes the whole conflict and reminds us that behind all the politics and maneuvering, there are real people facing impossible choices.
And speaking of peace, the article talks about these recent peace talks that happened between the U.S. and Russia in Saudi Arabia. But what's interesting is that Ukraine and European officials were not part of those discussions. What do you make of that? Is that a good sign, like maybe a step towards resolving the conflict, or is there something else going on behind the scenes?
Well, excluding Ukraine and European powers from these talks is definitely a significant development. On the one hand, it could be seen as an attempt to find common ground between the U.S. and Russia before bringing everyone back to the table, maybe streamlining the negotiation process a little bit.
Wow.
But it also raises concerns about transparency, right? Is Ukraine's voice being heard? Are their interests being represented in these closed-door meetings? It's crucial for them to have a seat at the table and be a part of any negotiations that could affect their future.
Yeah, absolutely. And the article also points out that Russia currently controls like a fifth of Ukrainian territory, and they're not showing any signs of giving it back. What does that mean for a peaceful resolution? And how do these mineral rights negotiations fit into all of that?
Well, that's the heart of the problem, isn't it? Russia's stance on territory is a major roadblock to any kind of negotiated settlement. So the question becomes, could these mineral rights become a bargaining chip? Could Ukraine offer them as a concession to get Russia to give up territory?
Or could the U.S. use them as leverage, to push for a better outcome for Ukraine?
It's a high-stakes game, and it's hard to say how it will play out. We're witnessing a real-time case study in international relations. Economic interests, political maneuvering, and the human cost of war are all intertwined. It's fascinating, but it's also incredibly complex.
It's like a multi-layered chess game with global implications.
Exactly, and it's a game that's far from over. This whole thing with Ukraine, though, it's bigger than just Ukraine, right?
Yeah, I was just thinking that. What are the bigger, implications?
Well, like we said, China is like the big player in the rare earth mineral market. This potential U.S.-Ukraine deal could really shake things up. The U.S. could become less dependent on China.
So it's like a power struggle, right, for control of these resources.
Exactly, and the winner of that struggle could end up shaping the global landscape. Like, it could affect everything from, technological progress to the balance of power between countries.
It's crazy to think that something like mineral rights could be that influential.
It is, but resources are everything, especially these days with technology developing so rapidly. Whoever controls these key ingredients for technology, well, they've got the upper hand.
The article also mentioned something about a phone call between Trump and Putin. Apparently that call kind of set the stage for those peace talks in Saudi Arabia. What do you think about that?
It's definitely an interesting detail. Makes you think that Trump's still trying to pull some strings, even though he's not in office anymore. And given his, let's say, complicated relationship with Putin, it raises a lot of questions.
Yeah, is he really trying to help broker peace, or is there something else going on?
Right. Is he acting in the best interests of the U.S., or does he have his own agenda? It's hard to say for sure.
It seems like Trump's personality, just his whole history as a deal maker, it's still a factor in all of this.
Absolutely. He's a wild card in this whole situation, and that makes it even more unpredictable.
The article ends on a pretty somber note, with descriptions of Russia celebrating Defender of the Fatherland Day while Ukraine's still under attack. It kind of reminds you that while all these negotiations and power plays are going on, there are real people caught in the middle of this.
It's a stark reality check. It's easy to get caught up in all the political drama, but at the end of the day, people are suffering in Ukraine. Lives have been lost, families have been torn apart, their future is uncertain. It's a reminder that we need to find a way to end this conflict.
Yeah, definitely. But like we talked about before, achieving peace is easier said than done.
Exactly. The territorial disputes, the competing interests of all these players, and then you throw in someone like Trump, it's a mess. It's really hard to see a clear path to a solution.
So for our listeners, the ones who are trying to understand all of this, what's the most important thing to take away from all this?
I think the biggest takeaway is this conflict is so much more complex than it looks at first glance. It's not just a war between two countries. It's a global power struggle, a fight for vital resources, and a tragedy for the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, it's a reminder that what happens in one part of the world can have a ripple effect across the globe. And it shows why it's so important to stay informed and engaged with these issues, even if they seem far away.
The more we understand these complex global dynamics, the better prepared we'll be for the challenges of this century.
So we've talked a lot about the political side of things, but what about the impact on technology? We've mentioned how important rare earth minerals are for smartphones and computers, but...
And electric vehicles, renewable energy, even weapon systems.
They're pretty much the foundation of the future. So how could this deal between the U.S. and Ukraine, how could it change the future of technology?
If the U.S. manages to secure a large supply of rare earth minerals from Ukraine, it could really shake things up in the tech world. It could reduce the reliance on China, give them a competitive edge. They could potentially speed up the development of new technologies and even control the supply chain for essential components.
That's huge, but doesn't that also raise some ethical questions?
Of course, we can't just ignore the potential environmental and social costs of mining these minerals. Are the mining practices sustainable? Are the workers treated fairly? What are the long-term effects on the environment and the communities where the mining takes place? These are all critical questions we need to consider.
Yeah, it's not enough to just get access to these resources. We need to make sure it's done responsibly and ethically, taking into account the well-being of people and the planet.
Absolutely. We need to strike a balance between technological progress and ethical responsibility. We need to think about the consequences of our actions.
It's clear that this whole issue of mineral rights is about much more than just politics and economics. It's a window into the future of technology, global power dynamics, and the ethical challenges we're facing as a global community.
It's a perfect example of how interconnected these issues are. Something that might seem like a regional conflict or a business deal can have far-reaching consequences for the environment, social justice, and even the future of technology.
It's a reminder that we need to be more aware of the ripple effects of our actions. Everything is connected.
That's why it's so important to stay curious, keep asking questions, and keep exploring these complicated issues.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into this, this whole world of mineral rights and Ukraine and the future of tech, what's like the big question? Like, what should our listeners be thinking about, even after they finish listening?
I think the core issue here is this. How do we make sure that we're not sacrificing our values in the pursuit of these resources? Can we have technological progress without exploiting vulnerable countries or compromising what we believe in?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just about who gets the minerals right. It's also about how they get them and what it means for the future. We've talked about the potential for conflict, the risks to the environment, the impact on people's lives. It's complicated.
It is, and it's only going to get more complicated as the demand for these resources keeps growing. We have to find a way to balance our desire for new technologies with our responsibility to the planet and to each other.
So where do we go from here? Are we just headed for a future where powerful countries are constantly fighting over these minerals, leading to more conflict and more instability?
That's definitely a possibility, but it doesn't have to be that way. We need to start thinking outside the box. Can we develop new technologies that don't rely so heavily on these scarce materials? Can we get better at recycling? Can we consume less? Can we create a system where the benefits of these resources are shared more fairly?
Those are all good ideas. It seems like we need a whole new approach. Like we need innovation, we need to work together, and we need to change the way we think about these things.
Exactly. We can't just keep doing the same things and expect a different result. We have to be proactive, we have to be creative, and we have to be willing to challenge the way things are.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. And it's clear that this story isn't over yet. There's so much at stake, and the choices we make now will have consequences for a long time.
It's a story that touches on so many important issues, geopolitics, economics, technology, ethics, sustainability. It really highlights how interconnected everything is and how our actions have consequences that go way beyond ourselves.
So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep digging into this. Don't just take our word for it. Read the article we discussed, do your own research, form your own opinions.
And don't forget to think critically, question everything, challenge your assumptions, be open to different perspectives.
The world needs more people who are informed and engaged, people who are willing to grapple with these complex issues and work toward finding solutions.
Who knows, maybe you'll discover something we miss. Maybe you'll have a brilliant idea that helps us overcome these challenges and build a better future.
And if you do, we want to hear about it. Connect with us on social media. Let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, stay curious, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.